Every major news outlet right now is running the same headline: Hantavirus, cruise ship, outbreak. And in the last 48 hours I have received more messages, more calls, more panic texts from patients than I have seen in years. Not because this virus is what they think it is, but because nobody, not one of those headlines, is telling you what this pathogen actually does inside a body that is 65 years old, what it does to lungs that have been breathing for 7 decades, what it does to a cardiovascular system that is already working harder than it did at 40, and that gap, that specific dangerous gap between what the news is telling you and what your doctor should be telling you is exactly what I am going to close in the next several minutes. My name is Dr. Pablo. I am a board-certified geriatrician with 18 years of clinical experience, and my specialty is cardiovascular and respiratory health in adults over 60. This is not a panic video. This is not a reassurance video. This is a medical briefing, and by the time we are done, you will know what hantavirus actually is, how it moves, what it does inside the aging body specifically, what your real personal risk looks like today, and most importantly, the one piece of information that could change a clinical outcome if this ever becomes relevant to you or someone you love. Before I give you that information, I need you to hold one idea for the next few minutes. There is a feature of this virus, one specific biological characteristic that makes it uniquely dangerous for adults in the 60-plus age group in a way that is almost never discussed in general coverage. I call it the silent window, and I will explain it fully. But I need to build the foundation first, because without that foundation, the silent window will not mean what it needs to mean to you. Let us start with what hantavirus actually is, because the level of misinformation circulating right now is significant. Hantavirus is not a single virus. It is a family of roughly 20 distinct viral strains. The name originates from the Hantan River in South Korea, where researchers first isolated one of the primary strains in the 1970s. This is not a novel pathogen. This is not something that emerged from nowhere. Scientists have been studying this family of viruses for more than 50 years. The first time most Americans heard the word was 1993, during an outbreak in the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, the area where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico converge. It struck hard. The fatality numbers alarmed the medical community. And then, for most people outside of clinical medicine, the conversation went quiet. The reason it went quiet is one of the most important single facts about this virus, and we are going to get to it. But first, the most urgent misconception I need to correct right now. People are assuming hantavirus spreads the way COVID-19 spread. Person to person, shared indoor air, respiratory droplets passing from one infected individual to another in a closed space. For virtually every known strain of hantavirus, that is not how this works. The transmission route is fundamentally different, and understanding that difference is the first step to understanding your actual risk. Hantavirus is carried by specific rodent species: deer mice in North America, different rodent populations across Europe and Asia. The virus lives in their urine, their feces, their saliva. When those excretions dry in an enclosed space, a garage, a barn, a cabin, a storage room, an attic, they break down into microscopic airborne particles. And when a human being breathes those particles in, that is the moment of exposure. No physical contact with the animal, no bite, no visible contamination. You walk into a space, you move some boxes, you sweep a floor that hasn't been touched in 8 months, and invisible particles, no smell, no color, no warning signal of any kind enter your lungs. You walk away feeling completely normal. That is the beginning of what I mean by the silent window. And for adults over 60, that silence is more dangerous than it is for anyone else. Here is why. When you are 68 years old, your mucociliary clearance, the mechanism your respiratory tract uses to filter and expel foreign particles, is not what it was at 35. The cilia lining your airways move more slowly. The mucus layer is thinner, the initial physical barrier that healthy younger lungs use to trap and remove inhaled contaminants is measurably less effective in the aging respiratory system. This has been documented extensively in pulmonary research, including work published in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine. What that means in practical terms is this: the viral load that reaches deep lung tissue in a 65-year-old after a given exposure is, on average, higher than it would be in a 40-year-old exposed to the same environment for the same amount of time. The body is not filtering as aggressively, and that matters enormously when we look at what this virus does once it gets in. There are 2 major disease presentations caused by hantavirus, and they attack the body through entirely different mechanisms. The first, and the one most relevant to North American viewers, is called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome. It begins deceptively: fever, muscle aches, fatigue, a headache that does not respond well to the usual remedies. The patient feels genuinely terrible, but the symptom pattern looks like influenza. They rest, they drink fluids, they tell themselves it will pass, and for 3 to 5 days, that assumption seems reasonable. Then something changes. The lungs begin to fill with fluid. The accumulation can be rapid, faster than most people expect, faster than patients can mentally prepare for, and in severe cases, the progression from manageable discomfort to critical respiratory failure can happen within hours. The case fatality rate for hantavirus pulmonary syndrome is approximately 38%. Nearly 4 in 10 people who develop this presentation do not survive it. The second presentation, more prevalent in parts of Europe and Asia, is called hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome. Here, the virus targets the kidneys rather than the lungs. It causes internal bleeding, severe inflammatory damage to kidney tissue, and in serious cases, complete acute renal failure. The case fatality rate in the most severe strains reaches 50%. I am telling you these numbers because you deserve accurate information. But I want to be precise about something, because this is exactly where misunderstanding causes harm in both directions. Case fatality rate and incidence rate are two completely separate measurements. A virus can carry a 38% fatality rate among those who develop it and still represent a very narrow population-level risk if the number of people who actually encounter the specific exposure scenario remains genuinely small. For hantavirus, that exposure scenario is specific. It requires contact with rodent-contaminated material in an enclosed space. It does not circulate through normal human interaction. It does not pass through a grocery store, a church, a waiting room, a family dinner. The World Health Organization's current assessment places global population risk at low, and for the vast majority of people watching this, that assessment is accurate. And this is where I need you to stay with me. Population-level risk and individual risk are not the same calculation. And for a specific subset of adults over 60, the individual calculation looks very different. Now I need to talk about the one exception in the transmission pattern, because it matters for context. The Andes virus, found primarily in South America, has demonstrated limited human-to-human transmission in documented cases, not efficient transmission, not the kind of spread we associate with influenza or COVID, limited close contact. Transmission documented in specific case clusters. Every other major strain requires that rodent exposure pathway. That is why this is not 2020. That is why infectious disease specialists are not sounding the same alarms. The biology is categorically different. But here is what I want you to hold from this first section. The danger of hantavirus for adults over 60 is not primarily about the transmission route. It is about what happens after the exposure in the body, during the silence, before the symptoms appear. And that is what we are going to go into deeply when we come back in the second part of this. Because the silent window I mentioned at the beginning, the feature of this virus that makes it uniquely consequential for this age group is not just about how long it takes for symptoms to show. It is about what your cardiovascular system is doing during that window without you knowing it. And that is the piece the headlines are leaving out entirely. Let me tell you about a patient of mine. Her name was Dorothy, 71 years old, retired school librarian from Central Ohio, grandmother of 4, the kind of woman who kept her house immaculate and her vegetable garden running into late October every year. Dorothy had well-managed hypertension. She took Hurlis and April faithfully. Every morning, her blood pressure was consistently in the 120/75 range, and she came in for her quarterly checks without fail. By every clinical measure, she was doing well for her age. In early spring, she spent a weekend helping her son clear out a storage building on a rural property he had just purchased. Old structure, had been closed for at least 2 years. She moved boxes, swept floors, hauled bags of old insulation out into the yard. She wore a dust mask, the thin paper kind, not an N95, because she was thoughtful about those things. She came home tired, as anyone would. She felt fine for about 10 days. Then the fever started. Dorothy came to see me assuming she had a respiratory infection. Her temperature was 101.4. Her oxygen saturation was 92% lower than I wanted to see, but not yet alarming. What alarmed me was the combination of symptoms alongside what she told me about that weekend. I ordered the right tests. We moved quickly. Dorothy spent 11 days in intensive care. Her lungs filled with fluid faster than I have seen in many patients. Her heart, already under the additional workload that comes with decades of managed hypertension, struggled to compensate for the respiratory crisis. She survived, but she did not come through that experience without consequence. Her pulmonary function at her 6-month follow-up was measurably reduced from where it had been before. and she told me, sitting in my office at that appointment, that the thing that stayed with her most was how normal she had felt for those first 10 days, how completely unsuspecting she had been. That is the silent window. For hantavirus, the incubation period, the time between the moment of exposure and the first appearance of symptoms, ranges from 1 week to 8 weeks. 1 week to 8 weeks of feeling entirely normal, going to your appointments, tending your garden, cooking dinner, playing with your grandchildren. While the virus is present, replicating, and in a cardiovascular system that is already managing the accumulated load of decades, beginning to create conditions that will become a crisis. For adults over 60, this silent window carries a specific additional risk that I want to explain clearly. Many patients in this age group are managing what clinicians call comorbid conditions: hypertension, atrial fibrillation, coronary artery disease, chronic kidney disease, type 2 diabetes. These conditions do not disqualify you from recovery, but they do change the margin. When hantavirus pulmonary syndrome begins to develop and the lungs start filling with fluid, the heart is called upon to compensate for the drop in oxygen delivery in a cardiovascular system that is already operating with reduced reserve capacity, which is a clinical reality for a significant portion of adults over 65. That compensation demand arrives at a system that has less room to respond. Research published in the Journal of the American Medical Association has documented that older adults with pre-existing cardiovascular conditions face significantly steeper clinical trajectories in serious respiratory illness compared to younger patients with no comorbidities. The virus is the same. The body it enters is not. This is point number 1 of what I want you to take from today, and it is the most important one. If you have hypertension, if you have a history of any cardiac event, if you are managing atrial fibrillation or coronary artery disease, your margin for delayed care in a serious respiratory illness is narrower than the general guidance suggests. And that means the decision point for seeking emergency attention needs to come earlier for you, not at the stage where you are struggling to breathe, but at the stage where fever and progressive fatigue arrive together within a plausible exposure window. Point number 2. Know the exposure environments. You do not need to fear your neighborhood or your normal indoor spaces. But if you have any enclosed space, a cabin, a barn, a basement, a storage unit, a garage that has not been fully cleaned and assessed in over a year, and rodent activity is possible in that space, that environment carries real risk. The signs of rodent presence are specific: droppings along baseboards or in corners, nesting material, shredded paper, fabric, insulation in undisturbed areas, gnaw marks on wood, plastic, or stored materials. If you see any of those signs, do not enter that space without the proper precautions. Point number 3 is the precaution protocol, and every detail of it matters. Before you touch anything in a space with potential rodent contamination, open every window and door you can access and wait a minimum of 30 minutes. That ventilation step is not optional. It is the single most effective thing you can do to reduce the concentration of airborne particles before you enter. Then put on an N95 rated respirator. Not a surgical mask, not a cloth covering, an N95. The particle filtration standard matters here specifically because the viral particles we are discussing are at the lower end of the size range. Mix 1 part household bleach with 10 parts water and use a spray bottle to wet all surfaces, floors, shelves, boxes, anything you are going to handle before you wipe or move anything. Never dry sweep. Never use a standard vacuum without a HEPA filter in a space with potential contamination. Dry sweeping or vacuuming without HEPA filtration aerosolizes exactly the particles you are trying to avoid. If the space is heavily contaminated, substantial droppings throughout, visible nesting material in multiple locations, the honest recommendation is professional remediation. I understand that carries a cost, but the cost of professional remediation is measurably less consequential than 11 days in intensive care. Before I give you the final and most critical piece of information today, I want to stop for a moment and ask you something directly. Write your age and where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. I ask every video, and I mean it every time, because who is in this audience shapes what I cover next. If you are 62, watching from rural Montana, your exposure context is different from someone who is 70 watching from a 15th floor apartment in Chicago, and I want to know where you are. Point number 4. Know the symptom pattern and know the decision point, because this is where outcomes are determined. If you develop fever, significant muscle aches, and any degree of breathing difficulty or chest tightness within 1 to 8 weeks of any potential rodent exposure, you go to an emergency room, not to an urgent care clinic, an emergency room. And when you get there, you tell the physician specifically that you had potential contact with a rodent-contaminated enclosed space. Those words change the diagnostic process. They put hantavirus on the differential immediately, and that changes the speed at which the right interventions begin. With hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, the window between manageable illness and critical respiratory failure can be measured in hours. The information you give that emergency physician when you walk in the door is not a formality, it is a clinical tool. Point number 5, and this is the piece I mentioned at the very beginning that most of the news coverage is completely omitting. Your baseline immune function right now is not background noise. It is your primary defense against every serious pathogen you will encounter, and there are specific levers that are directly within your control. Sleep. A minimum of 7 hours per night consistently. Not as a preference, not as an aspiration, as a medical priority. Immune surveillance, your body's ability to identify and respond to a viral threat early drops measurably with even moderate sleep restriction. Research from the University of California, San Francisco, documented that individuals sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night were 4 times more likely to develop a clinical illness after viral exposure compared to those sleeping 7 or more hours, 4 times. Vitamin D levels matter in this age group specifically. Deficiency is common in adults over 60. Sun exposure decreases. Dietary sources are often insufficient, and kidney conversion of vitamin D to its active form becomes less efficient with age. If you have not had your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level checked recently, ask your physician for that test. Deficiency has been directly linked to impaired immune response speed and reduced natural killer cell activity, the cellular mechanism your immune system uses as a first line of defense against viral pathogens. Visceral adiposity, the fat carried around the midsection, drives chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that measurably slows acute immune response. This is not an aesthetic issue. It is a functional immune issue with direct clinical consequences, documented extensively in research from Johns Hopkins and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And if you are managing any chronic condition, kidney disease, hypertension, diabetes, discuss any changes to your health routine with your physician before you implement them, because your medical history genuinely changes the priority order. Now let me close with the practical schedule, because information without application is just information. If you have an enclosed space that may carry rodent history, address it this week, not in 6 weeks when the headlines have faded and this has moved to the back of your mind. This week, while the awareness is front of mind, assess the space from the outside first. If you see signs of rodent activity, follow the full precaution protocol or call a professional. If you work outdoors, in agriculture, in construction, in environmental management, or in any role that brings you into contact with older structures and enclosed spaces regularly, your exposure risk profile is not the same as the general population, and you should be applying the precaution protocol as a matter of standard practice, not just in response to a headline. And regardless of your specific exposure context, prioritize your sleep tonight. Get your vitamin D level checked at your next appointment. If you have not had a full cardiovascular workup in the last 12 months and you are over 65, have that conversation with your doctor. Not because hantavirus specifically demands it. Because your cardiovascular reserve, the margin your heart and lungs have to respond to any serious illness, is the single most important factor in how you come through the illnesses that do find you. Building that reserve is not reactive. It is the work you do before you need it. Dorothy is doing better. She still comes in for her quarterly appointments. She still keeps her garden. Last fall, she sent me a photograph of what she grew: tomatoes, peppers, herbs arranged along a wooden fence. She also sent me a note. It said she had bought 3 N95 masks and a bottle of bleach and put them in the storage cabinet in her garage. She said she wanted to be ready before she ever needed them again. That is what rational preparation looks like. Not alarm, not dismissal. Specific awareness applied to specific situations before the moment of exposure arrives. The goal of this channel, the reason I stand in front of a camera and talk to you about things that are difficult and sometimes frightening, is to give you the kind of information that makes that preparation possible, not fear, clarity. If this gave you something real today, share it with someone who has been forwarding you the panic headlines. They need the context more than they need the fear. Subscribe if you have not already, because next week I am going to walk you through exactly how the aging cardiovascular system responds to serious respiratory illness, the physiology, the warning signs, and the steps you can take right now to strengthen your reserve before you ever need it. Given everything we covered today, that conversation is going to matter to you directly. I will see you then. Take care of your health. It is the only one you have.